when people try to find out why I am so unconventional, I want to let you know that I'm not trying to be. It just works out that way as I'm trying to be honest with the issues as I have been able to discover them and uncover them. And the truth is really that I think it's important that each of us be who we are, be honest about the realities that we see, and that we draw the conclusions that are most genuinely, authentically coherent for ourselves. And if we can do that, it isn't even really important that we end up always agreeing with each other. It's good enough if we talk with each other, share with each other, grow together, because it's in that kind of an environment that we discover some of the rough edges, make some of the changes, become convinced, grow, and learn how to deal with honesty and the way that each of us have to see different things differently until such time as we really can honestly be in agreement. But tonight, because this is one of the first shows that I'm doing where I'm actually teaching some ideas, I thought it would be helpful if I went back to the beginning of my particular journey in the way that it caused me to veer off of the path of tradition. And doing so feeling that I really had to, that it was what I needed to do, that it was what honesty was begging of me. Now, I began preaching and teaching back in 1972, very actively. Before that, I had been, passing out tracts and doing various things that many Christians would end up doing, as we thought we should back then in the 70s. But I was very active in that sort of thing, sometimes officially, sometimes unofficially, ended up being involved with 3 different churches. But I left the ministry in 1981. I returned briefly in about 1989. But I did become a music director of a church in 1994 and remained in that position for about 10 years. So in some sense, it's been a while, and I guarantee you, I'll have to apologize that some of my skills might be a bit rusty, so I hope you'll help me out. I hope you'll ask a lot of questions, and if there are any listening who really have some area of expertise or have some ability in some of the areas I'll be addressing, I would be very honored if you would participate as well, offer confirmation, correction, or whatever. So that'll all be a part of the process of pursuing honesty. Anyhow, it all began with my desire as a minister to be very familiar with the Greek of the New Testament. I really wanted to do that. At the time, I really felt that, by reading the Greek, that is exactly how I'm going to know what it is I should be preaching and be preaching it as it really ought to be heard. And so back in the late 70s, I was in the habit of reading something in Greek every day, 15, 20 minutes. I was often reading the Septuagint or Theodotion or the New Testament and sometimes the Church Fathers, and really trying my best to get very familiar with the way the Greek language worked. And so it was that study of Koine Greek in an attempt to be someone who was truly aware of it and familiar with it that led me to some discoveries that ended up forcing me to go in some different directions. It turned me from fundamentalism into being something unconventional. It turned me from somebody who was sort of spoon-fed into someone who felt that I had to have a more honest response to the things that I was discovering. It all began really when I was one day, it wasn't one day, it was actually a period of about a month, where I was studying the Greek New Testament and its quotations from the Old Testament. And I found that sometimes the New Testament was quoting the Old Testament based on the Septuagint, sometimes apparently some fresh translation, sometimes even something that very much resembled Theodotion, which at the time I didn't realize might be troubling, seeing as that Theodotion wasn't even translated until 150 AD. Nonetheless, I'm making these comparisons, and I realized that sometimes these translations were not working well, and this troubled me in terms of my belief that somehow the Bible was supposed to be inerrant and authoritative. And it made me wonder, well, how can something suddenly become authoritative? And now we have a version of the Old Testament that says one thing and a quote in the New Testament that really says something else. And well, which one's authoritative? Did this the New Testament verse now void and nullify the thing that used to be authority? And so it started to make me wonder, are there some problems here? And that's what began my more serious study of linguistics. Now, for some people, they can't think of anything that would be drier and more difficult and more uninteresting to study than linguistics, which is basically the study of how language happens and how people acquire it and what they do with it and what some of the things are that operate under the hood that make language what it is. But that was a fascination of mine way back. In fact, the first time when I had graduated from high school and I wanted to go to college, my first dream was to go to the University of Chicago and study linguistics there. But when I saw what the tuition was, I realized this is not going to happen. But I returned to a study of linguistics in general, and I began to discover that, the study of Greek that I had been doing was in fact beginning to fall apart for me. The first thing that I should tell you, therefore, is that I want to give to you, as I have now come to understand it, somewhat of a history of the New Testament written in what is called Koine Greek, and show you some of the history that lies behind it that does not cause the New Testament to be a book that we can't use. We certainly can, and it certainly has great value. So my point is not to try to dismiss it as a book or to dismiss it as having value for us as people who believe in Christ, but rather that the book is not what we had been traditionally taught it was, that it's something other than that. So there's more options than simply accepting it for the way it was given to us or totally rejecting it. And so I found myself accepting its legitimacy, but on different terms than what had been originally taught to me when I first began studying it. Now, before I can talk about the history of the Greek that is used in the New Testament, I might need to go into a bit of a general study of language. You know, a native speaker of a language uses a wide variety of linguistic dynamics. They do it unconsciously. We never stop to think about why we say the things we do, why we say it that way. Why do we, for example, say things like, ooh, I was head over heels, when you stop to think about it, head over heels is the way we normally are, unless you're upside down. And yet we use that phrase to kind of indicate that we kind of flipped up backwards or something, and the phrase doesn't actually really say that. So how is it that we end up talking and saying things like that? In a sense, that's something that has to do with the way that language actually works. A native speaker of a language doesn't stop to think about it. They just use it in a way that seems to work for them and the way that seems to work when communicating. And we hold to various unquestioned, simplistic assumptions about language that until we actually begin to study it, we may not realize this. Part of what that means is that as Christians, if we believe that this Bible is somehow very important for us to study, and we don't have an understanding of how language works, we are likely to make a number of very inappropriate assumptions, draw various inappropriate implications from a book that we haven't actually learned about how the language of it works. We all acquire our language skills through use, trial and error, and we do it without focusing directly upon the language. Most of the time when we're trying to say something, we're focused on what it is we're trying to communicate, and we're never really asking ourselves, why do these words connect in that way? Why does a subject have to have a verb and maybe an object? And we just use the language because it works. Now, when we want to study a second language, one we don't know about, well, now we have a problem, because when it comes down to it, whether we realize it or not, different languages actually work slightly differently. And if we don't know that, we're going to make certain assumptions. This means that the Greek of the New Testament doesn't work the exact same way English does. And therefore, the way we treat the text that was originally written in Koine Greek can cause us to mistreat it, misuse it, because we're making certain assumptions we don't even realize that we're making because of our English background. So how do we study a second language? How do we become aware of what a different language is saying? Well, one of the ways we used to go about it and still do was we'd try to compile a dictionary. We'd try to find out, well, what are some of the words that they use in this other language? In English, when I want to say apple, I say apple. And when somebody in French is speaking, what do they say? Something like la plume. I'm not a French speaker, but I think that's the French word. So therefore, I might think that with the use of my dictionary, apple, la plume, apple, same thing, same idea. And this works well in a native tongue. If I want to increase my vocabulary, I can spend time reading the dictionary. Can I confess to you? This may prove to you that I've been a bit unconventional all along. When I was a kid, I used to read the dictionary. I'd just be looking for words and fascinated when I would find something that I thought, well, I could use that word. That's something else. And something else I used to do as a kid, went to the World's Fair in 1963 or 64. I was in New York City at that time. And my parents bought an Encyclopedia Britannica, and it went from, all the way from Aaron to Zygote. And as a kid, I actually spent time reading all the way through the encyclopedia. Just one of the things that I did. I guess it made me a bit unusual. Anyhow, if you want to learn more about your own language, it's probably workable to just read a dictionary, discover new words. Now, this works poorly, however, when you're translating in the absence of a context. Because in English, we have a lot of unspoken assumptions that you catch on to very quickly without realizing it, simply because you're using these new words with other people who already perhaps know them, and they can give you funny looks or correct your thinking and what have you. And through trial and error, you can actually learn how to use the word correctly. But when you're using a language that you don't know that well, that process is aborted and not really working so well. So dictionaries don't always represent the best way to study a language that you don't know, although you should do so that as part of it. The other thing that's good to know about a dictionary, and this is particularly a problem when you're studying a language that isn't your native tongue, is this. Dictionaries are written like history. They can be very biased and driven by an agenda. And that means that depending on where you got this dictionary, you can't compile your own dictionary when you're learning a language. You don't know it well enough to compile a dictionary. So whatever dictionary you're using was compiled by someone who had a particular point of view about that language, perhaps even particular political or social ideas and attitudes that they, without even meaning to, have just inserted into this dictionary. So studying a dictionary isn't necessarily going to be the best way to, or the only way to try and take a look at a language. So people who study other languages will also take a look at things such as grammar. That's a good way to look at another language. It's helpful, but there are also a lot of shortcomings when it comes to looking at grammar. Basically, grammars are the rules that a language would have for how to shape words, how to shape sentences, and almost every language has a verbal and a literary kind of set of rules. You can say things when you're just talking that you can't say when you're writing. There are ways in which words are spelled or represented in writing that can be sometimes ambiguous, but not necessarily when you're speaking it. For example, we say read and we say read, but we spell them the same way. So every language has various grammatical rules that have to do with how that language happens to put things together linguistically. However, when you're combined with a dictionary and the rules of grammar, there are some things that you don't realize you're missing. The truth is that although a dictionary can tell you what a word is in reference to, and although the morphology and the grammar can tell you how to properly structure it and format it, a good deal of the meaning that we have discovered through the study of linguistics, a great deal of the meaning that is found in words and phrases, isn't in the grammar. It isn't in the dictionary meaning of the word either. So, and sometimes it can have absolutely nothing to do with the meaning, or what sometimes, and this might be a weird phrase, linguists might talk about indexically appropriate usage. Every word, in ways we don't realize, points to things in a context, that it does so without really saying so. And this can be something that native users of a language are very familiar with, so familiar with that they don't realize that it's a total assumption that everybody understands, and yet it may be something that is no longer talked about or even documented that much. Well, today we have a ton of linguists who are documenting all sorts of things, so you got to read the journals, I guess. But I mean, for example, you see me here on the video, and I'm speaking in a way where the words and the mannerisms that I'm using, although I'm not telling you until just now, I am a teacher. Uh, there's something about the words that I'm using, the way that I'm saying it, the way that I put things together, that somehow is implying, by pointing to it in some behavioral way, that tells you I'm a teacher. Some people who have even seen some of my teaching ask me, are you a professor? Even though I may not have said I was, they got that impression just from the style that I used. And yes, I am a professor. I'm a professor of sound engineering at a local college. But in other ways that we use words where meaning is found in them, even though we don't necessarily talk about it. What if you were to see me on TV and somebody's pointing a microphone in my face and I'm saying, oh, it was awesome. I mean, the cops come around the corner and they're speeding along, and they finally pull over and they got this guy, they drag him down to the ground and they finally took him away. Now, if you catch me on video saying that with a microphone stuck in my face, although I didn't say it, almost every word I said, the exact way that I said it, is telling you something. What it tells you is this: I am a witness to an event. I'm not the reporter. I'm not the person who did it. I'm not the person who ordered it. I am a person who was there at the time and witnessed it. You know my role in the incident simply because of the way that I spoke. Whereas if I was the reporter, I might be standing up more straight, holding the microphone in front of me, instead of talking about the cops rushing around the corner. Authorities apprehended the suspect allegedly, and I'd be using different words that would tell you, without necessarily signing off at the end, this is Bob Greaves reporting, that I'm a journalist. So words contain meaning that is part of the way we tend to use them, that points to a certain context. And we rarely document this in our dictionaries, and it's not really a part of the grammar. This is a great deal of information that is often contained in a language only by the general knowledge shared by the native speakers of that language. And they're the only people who know about it, and they're the only people who really use it that way. Now, each language does differ a little bit in its philosophy of morphology. They put words together differently. Some languages, for example, might have a past tense, a present tense, and a future tense. And in one language, they might try to determine that something in the future is so certain to happen that they will use some special, perfect future tense to express its certainty. Another language might decide to approach it entirely differently. They might try to show the certainty of a future event by using the past tense and speaking with an emphatic tone. We sometimes do that in English. You might ask me to do 4 or 5 different things, and I might look you in the face and say, "Consider it done." You know, that, in a sense, is trying to imply certainty about the future. Languages form things differently. What this means is that, looking too far ahead, I'm not about ready to start talking exactly about Greek yet. But this does mean that sometimes when we're translating the Greek from the New Testament, that the tenses are not to be taken literally or seriously. Those tenses might be used in ways that have come to be known to imply other things than the tense itself might have grammatically implied. Future isn't always future, past isn't always past, present isn't always present, and it all depends upon the particular context, and a native speaker would pick up on it right away. But a non-native speaker would be unaware of whether or not they need to pick up on it, and if what was said makes complete sense, you wouldn't realize that you were taking it in a rigidly, overly literal way. Now, there was a time when this was the way we tended to study secondary languages. We would study languages that we didn't natively speak, or languages from the past, by trying to compile dictionaries and looking at their grammar and their morphology. But in the last few hundred years, the study of language has radically altered because of a number of people who discovered that there is a great deal more going on in even the language of a 5-year-old than we'd ever stopped to realize or think about. For one thing, languages go through an evolutionary development. They actually change over time, and they go through fads, and some of them rather quickly, some of them take 50, 60, 100 years. So if we discover something by studying Koine Greek from a document that was written, say, in 300 BC, we might discover something about the way that word is used, but that does not guarantee that when that word is used in the New Testament, some almost 400 years later, that it's really being used in the same sense. It might not be. We'd have to have some other way of knowing that. Languages go through an evolutionary development. Events can change a language, and sometimes just general attitudes in a culture can change a language. Another thing that happened in the study of language is it's a big word if you've never heard it before: semiotics. Now, semiotics is a weird word. It's not really all that complicated, but the study of semiotics has to do with how human beings attach meaning to sounds and other things that might signify that meaning. It could be anything from the way we say a word to the way we shape yield signs as upside down triangles that are yellow. It indicates a meaning that we have learned to associate with the object. But the thing about these signs or these signifiers is that these signs and signifiers don't actually, in and of themselves, mean these things. We've attached this meaning. And we don't just attach this meaning just because, well, hey, let's staple this to that. There's actually a way in which the human brain and the linguistic abilities that we have go through a process that makes this connection a combination of arbitrary ideas and an innate sense of how language is formed through what the cognitive structures of the brain expect. It's one thing that's unusual about language, although there are thousands of different languages throughout the entire earth. The one thing they have in common is this: every human culture that can speak does. We all talk. We all form language using sometimes similar, sometimes different ways of forming it, and yet it's all completely different in the way we end up putting it together, and we all end up speaking. But semiotics is that study of how we end up going about doing it, how something becomes referred to with meaning and attached to that object that it refers to. But something that we also have discovered in the study of semiotics is that all words and signifiers come with baggage. Yeah, they come with baggage. Kind of like, in a relationship, when you meet somebody and issues that happened in previous relationships start bleeding into your relationship. Well, words work this way too. All words come with a certain amount of baggage. They have a history. They've been used in certain places, and they get a sense of having a reference back to those circumstances and situations in which they were used. Maybe an example of that in English is when I say the word scurry, I probably wouldn't talk about how a hippopotamus is scurrying along unless it seemed to be unusually delicate in a way I didn't expect. Elephants don't scurry. Mice scurry across the floor. Although the meaning of the word scurry could probably be used incorrectly, the truth is the word scurry oftentimes occurs in a context talking about little animals and little rodents. As a result, if I am in the midst of a disagreement with somebody and I say, after I disappointed them and told them what they needed to know, they just scurried off. There's a sense in which, in the use of my word scurry, I'm adding the baggage of implying, without saying it, and without taking responsibility for it, that they were a little rodent. Language has that kind of baggage in it. And the odd thing about this baggage and the other ideas is that these are vaguely and subtly defined and yet precisely armed with implications. And language works this way. But it's important to understand this. This is the way language works in the heart and mind of the people who use it. It's not necessarily in the dictionaries or in the grammars. And since each language develops its own baggage, just as each relationship might develop its own baggage, without a native speaker, you don't necessarily know how some of these things are working. Now, semiotics isn't just all that we study for language. It's connected to a philosophy called structuralism, which in many ways, the study of language has even decided to go beyond structuralism into things that we might call, and I'm not going to define them because we don't all need to be linguists here, but they go into things called generativism and functionalism, and linguistics has just gone a great distance since structuralism. We even try to understand the way in which different aspects that we had never thought of before affect the way we use language and what it really means. Studies in acoustics, anthropology, anatomy, neuroscience, philosophy, or psychology, sociology. We've developed theories of language structure. Noam Chomsky, a very well-known person in a variety of circles, is actually primarily a linguist. And he's put forth a concept of innate grammar, where we have this arbitrary connection with our actual language, but all based upon some innate ability of the brain to linguistically create structures of linguistic purpose. And we have cognitive processes that we've studied, and we've discovered the way these things affect the brain and affect the language that we use. And phonology, the way sounds are made, the way anatomy works, the way we can say or not say sounds, and how that affects the way words change. Comparative linguistics, looking at the way two different languages are similar and different. Now, the point of all this is not to try to turn you all into linguistic experts. The point is perhaps to actually get us to admit that maybe most of us are not. And what this means is that we know so much about how language works that we've discovered since the translations and since the creation of the Christian traditions based upon understanding and interpreting this Greek text, that there's so much going on that I think we need to really ask ourselves the question: the Greek dictionaries that we use, the Greek grammars that we use in Bible colleges, are these up to snuff? Have we really taken what we've learned from the field of linguistics and have we applied it to the ancient language of Greek as used in the Bible? And I'd like to say that there are probably a few scholars who have done that. But by and large, the average Christian does not study Koine Greek in quite this manner, and I don't know that they would even want to or have to. But the average Bible college student doesn't study Koine Greek that way either. More recent scholarly approaches are also not light, mainly because they tend to get in the way. They threaten tradition. They When you start talking about ideas that you now begin to discover by studying Koine Greek this way, you discover that the words of the Greek New Testament don't mean what we have been told they mean. Saved doesn't mean saved. Repentance doesn't mean repentance. Um, uh, Many propitiation doesn't mean propitiation. These words have been turned into something that is an extreme, overly rigid, almost manipulative version of what they originally meant by a church structure. And when real linguistics begins to study this language, it tends to get rejected by traditions that are threatened by it. It gets demonized. It gets countered with a quasi-intellectualism that tries to substitute the truth with defensive tradition with some sort of sophisticated approach that argues for tradition. Not all traditions are wrong or bad, but they got us to where we are today. But some of them are really, mistaken. They're ancient. They're naive. They're a part of our young race of human beings and not up to the snuff of what we can understand today. Well, I've said a lot about language. I'd like to now actually start talking about Greek itself. A lot of people don't know this, but we talk about, well, it's in the Greek. So find somebody who speaks Greek and you can read the Greek. Oh, well, it doesn't work that way. You see, we in America, we speak English, but we don't realize that the way they spoke English, even back in 1776, is a little different than the way we speak it today. It might be a little funny, stodgy, weird. But how about in 1611 with all those these and thous? That was not just Elizabethan language that was used in the King James to make it sound grandiose. That was the way a lot of people spoke in that day. That's how they talked. As it turns out, if you even go back to as far as Chaucer, you discover that you can go back far enough in the English language that it starts getting so weird, you can't read it. You have no clue what it's saying. Spellings are different, words are different. Some words you'll recognize, and yet they meant something completely different. There was one time when the word prevent, well, today the word prevent means, to somehow hinder somebody from doing something. But that actually came out of military strategy, when the word originally meant to go someplace before somebody else gets there. You pre-venture to where they're going. And what happened was that in military strategy, one of the ways of stopping somebody from accomplishing something is to get there before they do. And so over time, this word prevent came to be understood as being associated with hindering. So now, sometimes you'll read ancient words, I know that word, but it meant something very different than what you think it means. So we end up discovering this. The Greek language has many dialects, and it's actually gone not only by many dialects, but some of those dialects have gone by many names. The Greek of the New Testament is something we call Koine Greek, but it's been known by a variety of other names: Alexandrian dialect, Common Attic, Hellenistic Greek, the Holy Ghost dialect. That's an interesting one. We'll talk about that later. Biblical Greek and patristic Greek, called patristic Greek because many of the early church fathers wrote and spoke in that kind of Greek at that time because it was, after all, it was the language of the realm at that time. There are other documents that are also written in this same dialect of Greek. Historians Plutarch and Polybius also spoke and wrote in this language. The Septuagint was written in 300 BC in an earlier form of Koine Greek. The New Testament is written in Koine Greek, some of it a little bit more literary and closer to the contemporary Greek of that day. And when I say contemporary Greek, here's a little odd thing you might not know. Koine Greek was the Greek as spoken throughout the entire empire, but the people in Greece, they spoke a dialect of Greek that was a little bit different than that Koine Greek. So even for people who lived in Greece, Koine Greek was a second language, very close to their language, easy to understand, at least in earlier days. Uh, the early church fathers used this language. I think I mentioned that. But anyhow, something to know about Koine Greek is that it was used by the entire population of the Greek and Roman Empire as a secondary language. Nobody spoke Koine Greek as their primary language. And it was a brilliant technique used by Alexander the Great and his people who were his successors. So Koine Greek actually began around 330 BC, and it died about 330 AD. It was taught by the armies of Alexander the Great as a simplified subset of the native Greek as spoken in Greece at the time. It was spoken throughout northern Africa, Mediterranean Europe, and the Middle East. Now, it was a simplified version, and they were very successful in that day of getting most people to learn that secondary language. Part of the success of it was that to pay taxes, to get along with authorities, you had to be able to answer a Greek soldier in Greek, or your life might depend upon it. So it wasn't that difficult, and it was an amazing literacy attempt that although not all could write Greek, there was a great ability among the people throughout northern Africa, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean area of Europe who could speak Koine Greek, and it was the language of the realm. Helped Alexander the Great and his successors manage this huge empire. It was Greek pride, however. The people in Greece, they didn't particularly care for the fact that this version of Greek was being simplified, and they felt dumbed down and spoken throughout the realm. So in Greece itself, they had this kind of national pride, and that actually propelled that language to change in Greece some way. They tried to distance themselves from this Koine Greek, and they did do that. Now, contemporary Greek in those days evolved in its sophistication away from it. So much so that by the time we get to the year 330 AD, contemporary Greek was so different from Koine Greek that very few people even understood it. They didn't know it. And very few scholars were even working with it. And what we may not realize is that although it was the Greek Empire that taught the entire area of Greek, the Greek Empire fell. The Roman Empire came into power, and they found that Greek was the language of the realm, and they had it as a secondary language too. So for convenience sake, they continued to use Koine Greek as the language of the realm. But now, we have a dialect of Greek that the Greeks don't particularly care for, that the Romans don't own and they have no loyalty to. And so it's no wonder that after so many years of the Roman Empire, the language actually dies out and is replaced with Latin. And Greek dies out. The modern and contemporary Greek of the day continues to be spoken in Greece because that's how they talk there. But the Koine Greek stopped being spoken. And as it was stopped being spoken, part of the reason was that people had no clue how the Greek was working anymore. Latin replaced Koine Greek in the realm. Now, something you may not be aware of, and this is not a history often talked about when it comes to the Greek New Testament. The Latin versions of the New Testament and translations were replacing the Greek, and by the time Greek dies as a language, church fathers are speaking Latin. The realm is speaking Latin. Christians are speaking Latin. They're preaching in Latin, and nobody can read the Greek anymore. The Latin versions are also being altered and modified in various ways based on church tradition. And eventually, the Latin Vulgate becomes the official Bible of the Christian church. And that happened back in a day when humankind had not grown up enough to realize that there's a whole bunch of things happening in language. We just spent a half an hour talking about some of those things. They had no clue that these were dynamics in going on in language. And as a result, there was nobody in that day who realized that some of the meaning that is found in the Koine Greek of the New Testament would die and be lost if it didn't remain a natively spoken language. Then, several years after Greek has died out, a man by the name of Augustine is born about 354 AD, and he lived till about 430. And he comes along, and he's a Latin-speaking philosopher, and he later became a theologian. He was raised in a Christian home, but he regarded Christianity as foolishness at first, and although he was raised as a Christian, he was in love with philosophy and rhetoric, and he studied a great deal of that. And finally, he embraced a religion called Manichaeism, which is kind of a cosmological religion that talks about how the universe comes about and stuff like that. And it was really kind of a cocktail of various different ideas that came from Christianity, Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, and Zoroastrianism, correct? Anyway, but he also became a teacher, and he taught rhetoric. He never studied Greek, to the best of our knowledge. He was familiar with the fact that it existed and knew that the Greek New Testament existed, but he was never a Greek scholar. There's a few other things you need to know about Augustine that I think are very important when it comes to understanding the New Testament. Augustine was very influential when he became a Christian in defining the way the Latin was understood, and then later this affected the way that Greek ended up becoming reconstructed many years later. A few things you need to know about Augustine. He became a self-admitted sex addict, where his emotions about sex deeply disturbed him. He wasn't converted until about 386 AD. And even though he was converted, he continued to struggle with compulsive sexual behaviors, which he tried to manage by becoming a very rigid, disciplined person. He went into a monastery so he could stay away from women. He also studied Greek philosophy, translated into Latin by that time, and he studied theology to occupy his time. This is part of the way he tried to distract himself. He continued to teach rhetoric, and he struggled. He even shares in some of his writings about he struggled with what it means that he would have as a man at times erections. Shows you how he didn't relate well to sex. He saw them as involuntary, but he perceived this as his body being stirred toward lust on its own. And he speaks of things like, it leaves a straining lover in the lurch, and he had these difficult feelings to deal with when it came to his own sexuality. He never really resolved it well, and I personally believe that his concept of the sin nature is based upon his understanding and his perception of his own uncontrollable sexuality and the way that he mismanaged it. A couple other things that are interesting about Augustine that you might not know. The implications of what? I got a comment there. I'm not sure what implications you're looking at, but we'll get back at that later, hopefully. Maybe you could send me another message. My producer's talking to me through instant messages. If you could send me another message. Anyhow, a few things that are interesting about... okay, I'm getting another message here, and let me just check and see what my message is. Recent message, newcomer group. Aha. I'm not seeing the message, unfortunately. I wish I were, and I can't see where it's coming from. Joey Livingston has sent me. Okay, let me see what Bob is saying. Actually supports the importance of understanding words within the tradition, which mediates their meaning. But what Bob and the NCG are doing is to try to reinvent meanings for words like atonement, redemption in modern context ripped out of its context. Linguistics is therefore being used as a smokescreen for rationalistic skepticism. That was a comment that was brought in. I think it's an excellent comment and one that really requires being addressed. Let me read that comment again. The implications of what Bob is saying actually supports to the importance of understanding words within the tradition, which mediates their meaning. But what Bob and the NCG are doing is they try to reinvent meanings for words like atonement or redemption in a modern context. Okay, basically, this comment is concerned that what we are doing is that we are creating this spin that allows us to kind of, well, we're going to change everything on you, and we're going to do this through smoke and mirrors. Now, I think that there is a sense in which when you get scholars involved, that is a genuine and real danger. So therefore, it's important that whenever people think they're being scholarly, that they allow their scholarship to be reviewed by peers, other people who are scholars, and to have their justifications and their discussions to be occurring out in the open. This is one of the purposes of academic journals and peer reviews. And so I do see that what the comment is being made about as being a legitimate concern as to whether or not that is happening. There is no question, however, that at the time when the Greek of the New Testament was being reconstructed, that we already have a significant history of an evolution of theology that went through the Roman Church. We see the things that were happening. In fact, as I was about ready to mention, it's not until Augustine, which is around 400 AD, that Augustine is one of the very first to condemn the idea of an induced abortion. Up to that, the Christian church had no real solid view on that concept. He was the first major theologian to actually entertain the concept of a just war. He was the first major theologian to actually focus on Mary. We have enough of the early church fathers to see how the church is altering in its focus. So the traditions don't just mediate with one voice. The traditions themselves show a great evolution. And we can reconstruct undebatably the history of the Greek New Testament, even if we can't necessarily agree on how to undo the damage that was done in returning to an earlier thing. But I think that is an important comment to understand that when you're dealing with scholars, particularly scholars who like to talk to other people who are not necessarily scholars, kind of like what we're trying to do here, there is this danger that you have no way of knowing whether someone's pulling the wool over your eyes. And I think it's therefore important to ask those questions and to raise that eyebrow and to be concerned about that as a possibility. It's a very legitimate concern. I don't see this happening here, but then again, maybe that's my problem. And I think that if that is your concern, you should pursue it and see if through scholarship you can come to some other legitimate and appropriate conclusion. And if you can, then we need to talk about it. And so I would suggest that's a good way of dealing with it. Thank you for the question, the comment. I think that was a good one. I like that. and Joey, I found out where to see the comments you're sending me. That's going to work. Okay, well, meanwhile, I said that the Latin overtook in around 330 AD. Now the official language of the church is Latin. Greek is being ignored. Now, this is incontrovertible history. Greek was ignored in the church for close to 1,000 years. Koine Greek died. Now, there were still some scribes who kept on copying these things to preserve them, but there was nobody studying it, nobody keeping up with Koine Greek, and it died. And all of those semiotic and indexical elements of the language that would have caused a native speaker to understand it, they died. They are gone. The best we can do in reconstructing them is to take a look at the various contexts from the huge variety of documents we now have in our possession that have only recently been discovered to work out the meanings of what these words are. And at best, we can only come up with a list of legitimate possibilities that are in keeping with what we know about linguistic functions. But all the semiotic insights are lost. All the anthropological awareness, it's gone. The generative insights, the functional insights, the cultural usage, these things are gone. And by studying the history, we can We can recreate some of the possibilities, but these things happen as we know today by studying languages in a very arbitrary manner, and you can't ever guarantee you're always right, although you can discover quite a bit. Biblical Greek once again became the focus. And as it did, the problem was this. When Biblical Greek, 1,000 years after it died, became a focus again, there was a problem. No one could read it. It had been ignored so long that it was a dialect that it wasn't like classical Greek, which had still survived among the scholars who were still studying the philosophers, and it wasn't like modern Greek, where the way they were speaking in Greece today, and they actually, and this is an historical thing that you can look up yourself, the church for over 100 years lived in the assumption that, well, this must be a special Holy Ghost dialect, because at that time they weren't aware of there being anything other than the New Testament that was actually written in this language. And they thought it was a Holy Ghost dialect, a special dialect known only to the Holy Spirit and communicated to people who somehow mystically were able to understand it simply because, they spoke Greek back then and it somehow worked. This was an interesting story, and it remained the popular one in the church for over 100 years. So they reconstructed a Greek dictionary by going backwards, by looking at church doctrine, church tradition, and the Latin Vulgate and saying, well, this is what those words should have meant, and it's probably what they did mean. And so the Greek dictionary was actually reconstructed by using that backwards motion. But this relied on an overly manipulative, extreme, and dramatic view of words. It actually resulted in a precipitating also of the Protestant Reformation. Once they started looking and seeing, already discovering that some of the things in the Greek were different from the way Roman tradition was taking it, even when they started looking at the root words of certain words, various tensions began to develop, and it resulted in the Protestant Reformation coming out. Now, I would argue that today's translations are based on extreme biblical linguistic reconstruction that took place in a day before we even knew the great number of things we now understand about studying dead languages. Therefore, I think it's time that Bible-believing Christians and institutions of higher learning refuse the investigations that have been in the past in favor of re-examining this. Now, back to that comment that Joey sent me, I would even want to argue that we're not ready to do that. I'm not ready to do that. I'm not qualified to do that. I think it would take an entire boatload of scholars re-examining it, discussing the possibilities, arguing over the alternatives, and really seeking to reconstruct an understanding of Koine Greek based on this ancient view. Now, I've said as much as I think I can say, but at this point in time, the point of what I've been sharing with you is this. As I discovered that the Greek language wasn't what I thought it was, that the New Testament wasn't translated in a way that I thought it had been, with a discipline that was working, I came to the point where I realized I have to do something different, and so I started to. Anyhow, that's as much as we can say for now, and I will sign off. I hope to see you this coming Sunday with Sister Lisa Bertolini, and she'll be my guest. We'll talk with her. And thank you so much. We'll see you again for another teaching next Wednesday. Hi, I'm Bob Greaves, and I have a show here at the place called The Unconventional Pastor, and I would love it if I could get your participation in the show with your questions and your comments by video. Your question or comment can be something about the Bible, theology, maybe something you saw on an earlier show, or something you read in my blog. Here's what I'd like you to do. Make a video in as high quality as you can of yourself asking the question or making the comment. After you've made your video, upload it to Facebook, YouTube, or someplace else where I can find it and make it public or private. Then you can send me a private message in Facebook that includes a link to your video. In your message, make sure that you include your full name spelled correctly. I'm kind of excited about sharing as many of your questions and comments as I can possibly fit in the show. On behalf of the New Covenant Group, I'd like to thank you for your participation in making this show even better.